After watching this movie again after so many years, I realized an interesting quirk about Star Trek First Contact. The film is split up into two completely separate arenas, what's happening on the ship and what's happening on the planet. And after I was done watching the film, I realized another interesting quirk. I didn't like anything that happened on the ship, and I really liked what was happening on the planet. Now, even though I hadn't planned on doing this, I realized upon writing this review that I have way too much to say on both of these arenas to encompass one video. So I've decided to compartmentalize this and break the review down into two segments. This first part will deal with the parts of the film that take place on the ship, and part two will tackle the aspects that take place on the planet. That way we can at least end on something good. Now, let me say before I begin that on a technical level, every way in which this movie was made was actually really good. The Enterprise E is a fucking beautiful ship, and a huge design improvement over the clunky, awkward, picnic table-looking Enterprise D. The score is fantastic and amazing. In a movie that is comprised of mostly shooting, this theme of the film contrasts that by making it something beautiful. Star Trek First Contact is not a great film, but this score makes you believe that it is. I know it doesn't sound like it, but that is a compliment. And Jonathan Frakes proves to be a very competent director, shooting action, drama, however forced, and even horror elements all very well. Overall, the production value was really top-notch. But having said that, here's the review, again, starting with the parts that I didn't like. One of the first things they did in this film that galled me as a TNG fan is how they began. And it wasn't just the numerous fake-outs or the fact that they started off with a big action sequence either. On the contrary, they needed something like this in the beginning to keep people in the seats after all the squirming that took place in Generations. It's almost like they were literally saying with this opening, "Don't leave, don't leave, see? We have guns and explosions this time! No boring stellar cartography scenes, I promise you, please don't leave!" So no, that's not what bothered me. Here's what did. The first thing this film establishes is that Picard is defying orders by getting into the fray in the first place. Starfleet has ordered the Enterprise to stay out of the fight, and as we will see in the following scene, the reasons for this are beyond cheap.
Let's just say that Starfleet has every confidence in the Enterprise and her crew. They're just not sure about her captain. They believe that a man who was once captured and assimilated by the Borg should not be put in a situation where he would face them again. To do so would introduce an unstable element to a critical situation.
There are so many problems with this, and the first is that it's obvious what the writers are trying to do here, and they're setting up an artificial scenario to make that happen. We saw this happen just as much in Star Trek III when the Admiral told Kirk that there was no way he was going to Genesis, but for absolutely no good reason at all. Starfleet thinks Picard's presence will be an unstable element. Why? Picard has faced the Borg countless times since Best of Both Worlds, and he was even given a direct order to destroy them at the next encounter if given the chance. I mean, what is Starfleet worried about here? That Picard will join the Borg, or that he will be such a hollowed-out shell of a man because of his Locutus experience that he won't be able to act? We've never seen that happen in any of his encounters. Besides which, that there is no reason to keep the Enterprise out of the fight when the only person they need to not be there is Picard. Who defeated the Borg in the Best of Both Worlds? Riker. Who is Starfleet worried about here? Picard. So drop Picard off somewhere and have Riker take over the battle. Keeping the most advanced ship in the fleet out of the fight just to make one man stay away is ludicrous. And that's what this is. A ludicrous situation for the sake of the plot making Picard defy orders in order to look more badass. We see what you're doing here, movie, and it's really cheap. But they pull off that point, and the Enterprise is sucked back in time to the day before First Contact. You probably know the drill by now. The Borg assimilate the Enterprise one deck at a time, try to stop First Contact, and the crew has to stop them. So once again, let's focus on the aspects of what happens in the ship. Everything that takes place in the Enterprise E is all about walking down corridor after endless corridor and shooting Borg. Hell, they even start shooting them on the outside of the ship at one point. They shoot wave after wave after wave until it just becomes tedious and the movie feels like it's on a loop. None of this has anything to do with Star Trek The Next Generation. This is just a generic Space Marine action shooting film. It was actually fine in the beginning. The first time we see the Borg wake up and take action was greatly effective, but after the second, third, and even fourth time watching this, it just gets tedious. The reason this is that what's happening on the ship doesn't have any other theme attached to it. Think about another time travel movie in Star Trek, The Voyage Home. Here we see the crew trying to get the job done and all, but it was the question of killing the whales and what we were doing to our own future through short-sightedness that made these actions less than routine. Well, that and also what the crew was doing in that movie was much more interesting, but you see what I'm saying. Just watching the Enterprise crew shoot at Borg so they don't take over the planet isn't an interesting concept beyond the first few minutes of seeing it. And after a while, you wish they would either just do it or not, because it's really just going to come down to those two options. Now, the one thing they try to make interesting on the ship is what Picard is going through in all of this, and this especially is handled terribly. I'm going to put this plainly. In Star Trek First Contact, Captain Picard is Krug from Star Trek 3. I mean it, he's a blustering commander that shoots his own crew members, yells at everyone, and his own personal hang-ups cause him to make really stupid decisions. The problem is, Krug was not interesting, and these actions don't make Picard interesting either. None of these actions are designed to actually give the character weight or depth. They are only designed to show you how much this is bothering him as dramatically as possible. Time and again, the movie tries to frame Picard as the captain being brought low and forgetting his duty as a Starfleet officer, going too far, all because of his personal feelings about the Borg and what they did to him. The problem with that is that, well, Picard isn't going too far. On the contrary, he's doing everything he should be doing and nothing that he hasn't done before. He's being a little more grumpy about it, but his actions are still in the right. The crew should be trying to stop the Borg by any means necessary. This is the fate of the world we're talking about. Picard's feelings aren't causing him to do the wrong thing. They're causing him to do the right thing more forcefully. I find it amusing that the film doesn't seem to realize this and virtually makes itself bipolar as a result. Think about the Picard-Lily scene. In virtually the same sentence, Lily both condemns Picard for not trying to save an assimilated crew member, and then condemns him again for not blowing up the ship and killing all the assimilated crew members. I know that this was a popular scene among TNG fans, but I'm sorry, it couldn't have been handled worse. This was a scene that clearly just wants to make the point that Picard is forgetting himself, but without any thought to how to make this make sense in the context of the plot. And why? Because this is all about setting up a false conflict just in order to get Picard to do something the audience will find satisfying at face value. She convinced him to put aside his prejudice and blow up the ship. Great. But let's just think about that for a minute. First of all, they're trying to give Picard a personal obstacle to overcome, kind of like Kirk in Star Trek VI, when he had to overcome his prejudice against the Klingons. Now, I'm not saying this parallel was in the writers' minds when they wrote this, but they're essentially attempting to achieve the same goal. The problem is that by the time we got to Star Trek VI, we hadn't seen Kirk try to deal with this issue yet, and so all of his prejudice felt natural and new. But in The Next Generation, we had already seen so many great moments with Picard overcoming his experience with the Borg, and they did it in a way that was internally character-based rather than externally acting out. The scene where he broke down to Robert and declared that they took everything that he was. The scene with Guinan where he stood up and proclaimed, "It's not a person, damn it, it's a Borg," but then he actually talked to him. These moments made you feel what Picard was going through on the inside, rather than just making you look at what he's doing externally. They made you empathize with his feelings rather than just showing it to you by making him shoot and break shit. Think about that scene with Guinan and I, Borg. Would this scene have really been better if after he proclaimed the Borg wasn't a person, he then overturned a table and smashed a window with his gun? No. More would have been less, and it would also have been grossly out of character just as it was here. The only reason he does this in the film is that this is what they chose to do to make the films bigger and more dramatic, by enhancing the spectacle rather than the substance. In my view, this scene diminishes the tension and the drama. It doesn't enhance it. But let's look closer at the blatant contradiction in this scene. First of all, why is Picard refusing to blow up the ship? Wouldn't killing all the Borg in a single blow be a victory and a revenge in and of itself? I know they try to make the point that he didn't want to lose the ship, but it just seems flimsy to suggest that Picard has no problem killing people to eliminate the Borg, but he won't destroy his own property to do it. But then, after they establish that Picard is in the wrong for not blowing up the ship, they then have Lily making a federal case out of the fact that he shot a Starfleet officer.
Get out!
Or what? You'll kill me? Like you killed Ensign Lynch?
There was no way to save him.
You didn't even try. Where was your evolved sensibility then?
You can't condemn someone for killing a Borg and then turn around and condemn them for not blowing up the ship to kill more Borg. Yes, this is a fucking tragedy, but you know what? It happens. Every time you shoot a Borg, you know that you're shooting someone that was once an individual, someone's family or friend. It's just what you have to do to defeat them. And that's what made the Borg such a good villain in the first place, because they force you to take actions that you wouldn't ordinarily take. I mean, what is Lily's problem here? That he won't kill the Borg or that he won't try to save them? Pick one. Because without that clear motivation, the scene just comes off as the writers once again forcing the point of the scene down our throats. Lily convinced Picard to blow up the ship. Great. But what do we come away with after that? Nothing more than the knowledge that that happened. No conflict is resolved because they can't figure out what the conflict is in the first place. And a false conflict is the easiest way to deflate a scene, even if that isn't your intention. But the bottom line is that this was the one and only time they tried to inject meaning into anything that was going on the ship. And in my view, even though I know this is a really popular scene among TNG fans, this fell flat on its face. Adding to this is the fact that it makes Lily an almost totally pointless character. Honestly, outside of this one scene, you'd be hard-pressed to explain what she's even doing in the film. My problem with Lily is that she is all function and no character. Think about Jillian in Star Trek IV. Functionally, she was there to get the Enterprise crew the frequency for the whales, but character-wise, she had something directly in common with the Enterprise crew. She cared about the whales and wanted to see them come to no harm. She's a woman whose compassion for living beings is not limited to her estimate of their intelligence. When we look at Lily under this same lens, we find no character to speak of. Everything that takes place on the ship is just happening to her. There's no real participation on her part. For the entirety of the film, all this character does is follow Picard around as he leads her from A to B. The character's only function is in talking sense into Picard in one scene. Outside of that, she really may as well be anyone. But now I must come to what is probably the worst part of the film, the Borg Queen. I know it's been said 1,000 times, but this is quite possibly the most out-of-place character in all of Star Trek history. We have an individual Borg who is emotional, arrogant, manipulative, and I'm going to try and say this without throwing up in my mouth a little, sexual. In short, she is everything that the Borg are not. So why is she emotional? Why is she stupid and driven by dumb motivations other than the collective? The film never says. And the reason it never says is that she was never a concept the creators had in the first place. The Borg Queen was a studio idea. They felt that the audience needed one Borg to relate to rather than a bunch of mindless drones. Now, it would be easy to say that this was the studio's fault, but it's not. They wanted a single Borg in the film? Fine. But why make her a retard sex dominatrix that has nothing to do with the Borg? They made a single Borg for the audience to relate to in the series. He was called Locutus, and he was unmistakably Borg. This is just a dumb woman who seems to want to take over the world because she's devious and evil instead of single-minded and pernicious. Now, I could go on and on about what's wrong with this character. She has nothing to do with the Borg. She throws the entire concept of the Borg out the window and makes them less threatening and stupid. And all these things are true, but I want to focus on a more central problem with this. The problem with the Borg Queen is that we don't learn anything about the Borg through this character. All of her dialogue pertaining to her origins and her function are deliberately vague and are only designed to sidestep the issue. Because make no mistake, the writers are well aware that she just doesn't belong here. They have no idea for this character, and so they don't know how to answer these questions. Everything the Borg Queen does is at the service of the plot. She has no motivation outside of just giving the crew something evil to be against. And all of her dialogue is just an excuse for herself. She's like one big self-contained plot hole that tries desperately to justify its own existence every step of the way. And the worst part is that passively reacting to this one big plot hole is all Data has to do in this film. As I said in the intro, the easiest and most interesting characters to make the focus of a film are Picard and Data, but this movie fails to do that in a way that resonates with the audience or engages the characters at all. Sure, they're the focus of the film, but Picard isn't doing anything that makes him grow as a character. Everything he does is an external action that is designed to look dramatic. But in the case of Data, we get something that is built entirely around the plot and is in no way built around the character. The Borg capture him, and the Queen talks at him while he passively reacts to what she's saying. Seriously, if you break it down, that is all Data does in this movie. None of his actions or reactions have anything to do with him as a character. The dumb Borg Queen just switches his emotions on, and Data just sits there and reacts. I talked in the commentary about how simply adding hardware didn't make Data any more human. It was more to do with that component alone than it had to do with the character. Well, let me tell you, that goes double for giving Data human skin. The idea that this whole conflict was going to revolve around something physical, especially physical pleasure, was downright ridiculous and even just a little uncomfortable, especially considering that it was the Borg Queen who was providing that pleasure. I actually feel kind of gross and creeped out even saying that, but it's true. The Borg manipulates Data with sex, and Data's big manipulation to overcome is sexual manipulation. I'm not kidding. It is implied in this film that, for all intents and purposes, Data had sex with a Borg. The Borg were making no headway with Data until the Queen started sexually teasing him, again, gross and creeped out. This is the challenge the writers thought would be interesting for Data to overcome. No personal experience or discovery, just, yet again, another passive reaction to another component slapped onto his mainframe. The problem with this is that the mere act of having sex is the least interesting part of ourselves. What we can learn about ourselves through our sexuality can be fascinating and a truly personal experience, but this deals with none of that. It's just Data having sex with a Borg. And the worst part about that is that sex and the Borg are two completely incompatible concepts. It would be like if all of a sudden they said inexplicably that Klingons have the ability to fly. It really is that unrelated to them. The Borg don't even have sex. They don't reproduce that way. And they don't think of other people in those terms either. They, in their own collective mind, have evolved past this. So when you see an individual Borg woman teasing Data sexually and asking, was that good for you? You just want to punch someone for all that this is out of place. And it's a conflict that doesn't allow Data to grow as a character or see himself in a different light. He does it, it happens, and then the movie ends. And thanks to the big action climax, we realize that he was never really conflicted to begin with. He fakes her out and turns against her without even thinking about it. Honestly, what was the point of any of this other than to give Data screen time in the film and to have a climax that again would be satisfying to the audience on the most superficial of all levels? Data didn't succumb to the charms of the Borg. Great. But what do we come away with after that? Absolutely nothing but the end credits and the knowledge that it all worked out for the best. I know this kind of came off like a PowerPoint presentation rather than a step-by-step review, but honestly, there wasn't really much of a plot here to review in the first place. They shoot at Borg, and these things happen in between. For all of these reasons, it is my opinion that everything that took place on the ship in this film was complete and utter garbage. But don't worry, that isn't my final word on the film. There is plenty of other good stuff to go through. Unfortunately, I'm just not sure if it outweighs the bad.